Hi everybody, and welcome to this revision video on defense mechanisms, which is linked to Freud's psychodynamic theory of personality, which is part of the psychology of the individual topic for stage 2 psychology. So let's get started. Okay, so another part or another concept of the psychodynamic theory according to Freud was that the ID and superego are in constant conflict, which results in anxiety and stress. So if you watched my previous revision video on the ID, ego, and superego, I go into the ID and superego having conflict quite a lot. So the ego resolves this by utilizing defense mechanisms, which help to protect itself from negative emotions and stress. So what that means is that our ego will utilize defense mechanisms, okay, to keep our ID at bay and not upset our superego. So there are actually several defense mechanisms, but the most common ones that we look at for the new course in this topic are the ones listed here. Some of you may have heard of these terms before, and we're going to go through some examples in the next slide. But the most common ones are repression, regression, projection, denial, displacement, rationalization, and sublimation. So let's look at these in more detail. So I've taken this photo from your workbooks, your essential workbooks that you would have received by now. And this has got obviously what the defense mechanism is, the description or the definition, and an example. So in class and in your workbooks, I'm going to ask you to come up with more examples just so you've got your heads around each of the most common defense mechanisms. But let's just go through this. Okay, so repression is threatening memories or thoughts that are pushed into the unconscious mind. So an example of that would be not remembering trauma-based experiences from childhood. So just having a complete amnesia of a very traumatic event that happened in childhood or early on in life. So the person may know it happened, but they genuinely cannot remember the event taking place. So they've repressed it down into their unconscious to the point where it's not a part of their conscious or pre-conscious anymore. So they genuinely cannot remember the trauma, even though they know logically it happened. That is repression. So that's to protect the conscious mind and our ego from becoming aware of our unconscious and us getting too upset, according to Freud. Then we have regression, which is reverting to a childlike state when confronted with an overwhelming or unimaginable situation. So we regress back through the ages, back to our childhood, even if we're of adult age or close to it. So an example of this is an adult throwing a tantrum or slamming doors because you don't get your own way. So that would be typical of a child to do, but not as an adult. However, when an adult or an older child, 16, 17, 18, is showing regression, according to Freud, they're behaving in such a way that would be more common to be seen amongst a very, very young child, such as throwing a tantrum and slamming doors or stamping their feet because they don't get their own way for whatever reason. So that is a classic example of regression. And that is to not, again, protect the ego's mind and protect our conscious mind because it's too overwhelming or unimaginable to access, an unconscious desire or to face something that is too upsetting that may be linked to our unconscious mind. So we regress instead. Then we have projection, which is attributing our own unacceptable feelings and thoughts onto others as if they own them and not you. This is very common. So in other words, we are projecting, hence the term, our own unacceptable feelings or thoughts or desires onto somebody else. So a very classic example of this is when someone accuses their partner of cheating because they have and they know that their spouse hasn't. So a person may have been unfaithful to their husband or wife, and instead of admitting that and allowing those upsetting conscious thoughts into their mind that they are a cheater, they will accuse their spouse of cheating instead. All right, so, I didn't cheat, you did. Okay, so trying to project the unacceptable feeling or thought or behavior onto somebody else. That is classic projection. Then we have denial. All right, which I'm sure you've probably all heard of. So this is refusing to accept or acknowledge the reality of a situation. Just deny, deny, deny. It's easy to do this to protect our conscious mind. We just pretend it doesn't exist, in other words, because it feels better than facing the truth of the unconscious. So this may be, well, there's lots of examples of this one, but the one in your textbook, continue to spend money despite being in debt. Okay, so facing the prospect of being in debt is too painful. Don't want to accept that in my conscious thoughts. So I'm just going to continue spending money and pretend that the problem doesn't exist. All right, that is denial. Then we have displacement, which is quite common as well. So redirecting feelings and actions onto a substitute target. So we are displacing the anger or the negative frustration or negative feelings onto someone rather than ourselves. So we're displacing it. So a good example of this is taking your frustration out on your parents. I'll start that again. Taking your frustration of your parents out on your friends or siblings. So your parents may have grounded you or yelled at you or scolded you in some way. Rather than take your frustration out on your parents, you displace that frustration onto your friends. So you get snappy with your friends, or you get very snappy with your siblings and have a go at them or blast them. You're displacing your frustration onto someone else. So very, very common when it happens. Then we have rationalization. Okay, very common as well. So this is justifying unwanted outcomes with excuses or faulty reasoning. So, for example, the teacher did not cover the material on the exam. So rather than face the prospect of the person or the student not studying effectively or being lazy in class, nope, don't want to have that in my conscious mind, don't want to accept that harsh truth. So I'm going to rationalize my bad exam grade and blame it on the teacher. Oh, the teacher did not cover the material of the exam. I was really, really busy. It's unnecessarily hard. So you're trying to rationalize your behavior because facing the truth is too upsetting. And then we have sublimation, all right, which again is quite common, replacing unacceptable feelings with socially acceptable behaviors. So if someone has a lot of unconscious rage or anger or aggression, obviously that is not socially acceptable. So what people will do is sublimate it on in terms of being aggressive on the sport field. So they'll turn something that's unacceptable into something that is acceptable. So being aggressive on the sporting field is not seen to be a bad thing necessarily, depending on what the sport is. It's actually seen to be a good thing. So if someone is described as aggressive, it may be that they get a lot of positive reinforcement for being aggressive. So what they're doing is turning these unacceptable feelings of aggression into something positive or socially acceptable. Another example of this as well that I've just thought of is someone who has an unconscious desire to harm or kill people may join the army or the armed forces because that is a socially acceptable behavior to get that unacceptable aggression out. So that is sublimation. Now, again, these are all just part of Freud's psychodynamic theory. These are what they're called, and I'm sure you've heard of some of these. You don't have to believe that these are actually true or valid. You just need to know them, obviously. So you may disagree with Freud's theory as much as you want, including the defense mechanisms, but now you know what they mean and some common examples. So I hope you found this video useful, Year 12s. As always, if you've got any questions, let me know.